The 45-degree angle is key, and it's one of our major tenets in the nonlinear system. And that is because it represents a line of perfection, right? You divide the vertical and the horizontal, it bisects with that 45-degree angle, so it's archetypal in nature. And it is so important to the system because with my beginners, if I can just get them to line up their body, I just have them straddle this 45 and reach out, we can get rallies going within the first 5 minutes of any lesson. Same with the backhand. It's really all you need from the 45. Yes, you can pull in more and come out more, but just by reaching out to the 45, if you remember John McEnroe, he used to just go like this a lot. He'd jump at the 45 and he wouldn't have much of a backswing at all, but he was locked into that 45-degree angle. So it's a very important thing. And not only is it the optimal contact point, it's also your optical vision point, your depth perception is much better when your body is lined up like this, like a sharpshooter, right? You're like a sharpshooter with one eye closer to the target than the other. They triangulate, and in doing so, it gives you much better depth perception. You become the predator, as opposed to facing the net, where you're the prey, like a mouse or a deer in the headlights, or if you turn to the side, you're really only looking at the ball with one eye. So this 45-degree angle is truly perfect in nature, and you see it in every sport. When you see a golfer put the ball down to take a drive, it's not in between his legs, it's always at that 45-degree angle. If you see a baseball player in slow motion, the way they lock their leg at contact and make contact with the ball, you can see it's connected. It's right there at the 45-degree angle. When you see a basketball player line up for a free throw, right, they don't line up like this, or else they don't have the depth perception to hit the basket, right? They line up like this. You watch them, their feet are like this, and they're always juxtaposed, perpendicular, right, at this 45. So they have a much better view of the ball. So the 45 is really archetypal, and it's a big tenet in our system. And if you can stay disciplined at the 45-degree angle, you'll have incredible success, playing pretty much every day. Usually when you're off or you're hitting in the net, you're above the 45. That's why I say don't pass it, right? Get out to it. And if you have to be like Nadal and come up like this, fine. If you're more casual and you just let the elbow break, see, I'm out the 45. Before I touch it, I let the elbow break. But you don't go through the 45. That's when you hit the ball fat and dump it in the net and you have no feel. So that 45 really is the magical angle. Analog. Why do I call this an analog system? Well, let's start with the ball. The ball is round. So in order to move with the ball and with the speed of the ball and with the arc of the ball, right, because there's gravity involved as the ball travels, the best players in the world learn to move in an analog way. And so what ours is an analog system. And it's basically a system based on curves. So really there are no straight lines. We talk about the 45, but it's always as going in and out of the 45. So the idea of analog means always transitioning, always morphing into something else. And it's always in terms of curves. That's it. Our analog system, to be specific, is based on something called a standing wave. And if you go to the gym and you use those heavy ropes and you move your arms continuously in a figure eight up and down, the rope makes a very nice sine wave and you get exercise from the rope to your core, and it's a great exercise. Ours is done the same way, but instead of the hand moving continuously in a figure eight, it's our hips that move in a figure eight, and then the arm plays the part of the rope. That's why great tennis players will often say, man, he really roped that ball. So when I use the term bump, what I'm really talking about is contact with the ball. You hear other coaches and other advice telling you to hit through the ball. That's not really what's happening at the top levels or at any decent level. It's really about the bump. And that means at contact, See, your arm is round and you just bump the ball. So whether you're coming from a big swing like this, right, and you bump it, and then once you bump it, that's it. It's over. Same with the forehand. You can come off a big swing, but at contact, you just bump the ball. And once you've bumped the ball like this, you see how round I get, and I create this nice little, almost like an old Volkswagen hubcap, right? I create this curve in my arm. Some will call it a lag, but that's a little too digital of a term. Really, you want to get rounded back here. So, and you want to just bump the ball. And if it's a volley, it's the same thing. You bump it, and then the racket head trails. So you bump it, and it trails. So whether you're hitting flat or topspin, you really want to focus on that bump. And another time you want to really think about the bump is when you're in a transition, right? When you're in the middle of the court and you get a half volley or a low volley, you don't have to get through the ball. All you really have to do is create a nice round place for the ball to land, and you just bump it. So it really helps on pickups, volleys, ground strokes to understand this term of bumping the ball rather than just hitting it or trying to go through it. Just create a nice place for the ball to land and bump it, and it's just much, much easier concept and easier on your body and a much bigger swing. The other thing about the bump, I will say, is when you create this place for the ball to land and not try to get through the ball and you just bump it, the strings actually get to move back a little. Even the head of the racket moves back a little and the ball presses a little bit more air. So making that nice area for the ball to bump against is a much better hit, and you can get a whole lot of power without really having to swing that hard, because the symmetry of the strings going back and the ball getting air pressed in it, those two things really makes the ball pop off the racket face. Centered. One of the toughest things in tennis is really to stay centered. Most people center on their ego, right? They play the score. It's all up here. Instead of, where is your center? Well, it looks like the center of my body is right about here. So it's really important to stay centered and really understand when you're playing that you want to focus on your center and not trail off into the upper body and your brain and up here, because that's when you start to really lose your way. So when I say centered, I mean literally centered in the center of your body. Compressed. So I'll use this word compress very often on the forehand side. When you talk to a great player, and I've got a lot of friends and ex-students that were great players, you know, I would ask them, what's it feel like at contact? And I always loved the answer most of them gave me, and it was compressing. So, you know, as you go into your forehand stroke, right, your fingers are on the strings to make sure everything's turning and you're not just, you know, using one half of your body. So this left hand stays on for you righties, but then they split apart. And as you make contact, you compress. You see how the two hands compress? So I'm really on the ball. You don't want this hand here to splay out, because then it pulls your left side out, pulls your eyes towards the net. But when you compress these two hands, and on the volley, you see that? You compress them, almost like a squeeze box or a accordion, but it's out here like this. See? So they compress on the hit, and they compress on the volley, and they compress also on the overhead. See that? You don't just swing and lose control. You compress at contact, and you're locked into that contact point. So that's when I'll use the word compression, is really saying how you keep your body lined up to the ball at contact, particularly on the forehand side. Concave. When I talk about concave, I'm talking about the shape of your arm. And that's created when you start here in the center in your ready position. As soon as you turn your hips, you see your arm should begin to go concave in one direction or the other. See, this is concave, this line right here. See, and I get into this concave, and this is what people call a coil, right? So, and it's natural because This, imagine if I'm in a big pool of water. I couldn't just throw my racket back, right? It would drag back naturally. Or if you put a cover on my racket, right, and it went against the wind, right, and I turned my hips, right, the wind would hit it and it would drag back. So it's a very natural thing to get into this concave position. And it's also on the backhand. When you go into a backhand, you don't point your elbow, you get concave, you see, as best as you can. And that's why you use your lower body like this. You press forward with the head of the racket, elbow stays down, you see, and I'm concave, right like that. So you don't notice it with the players because it's done so quickly, but they go starting here at concave. That's how they get into their coil. So on both ground strokes and serves and overheads, you really get concave. You see, as soon as I start my hip rotation, the last thing that comes is the tip of the racket, and it creates this roundness from the shoulder to the tip of the racket. And that's concave, and that's your coil, and that's really where all the power is initiated. Connect. When I talk about connect or being connected, I'm talking about connecting your lower body, right, your hips down in here with this figure 8 motion to your upper body. See, that's so it's a seamless transition from, as you swivel to the right and to the left, to and fro. See, it's seamless transition. And this connection, you can see it everywhere in nature. If you watch a tree blowing in the wind, you see the bough moving a little and then the branches playing off of that. It's the same with tennis players. You even see a lot of them wait like this. What they're doing is connecting, right? They're connecting their upper body, their shoulders and their arms to their lower body. And that connection, you can see the drag, right? We'll talk about this later, but it's this contrary motion. As the hips move, see this? It drags the upper body. And the upper body is always catching up to the lower body. And it's the same with the strokes. You want to be connected on your strokes. What happens to some players, all of a sudden, they get nervous and they get arm dominant and they've lost their connection. So what I tell my students is get connected and stay connected. Before they get out a match, that's always my cry. And that's the one thing they try to do. They try to connect their lower body to their upper body. And they also try to connect the entire move with the flow of the ball, right? The ball rises and has its own kind of a figure 8, right? An S as it bounces and rises again. And you learn to connect the whole stroke with that flow of the ball. So when you do get the lower body and the upper body connected, you create this human fabric. You see this? Where it actually moves like a human fabric, and like a web. And that's a very nice feeling when you feel connected and you feel this natural flow from your core out to your racket head. You see it in all types of sports too, right? In baseball, they're waiting like this, right? They're always wagging their lower body in the rack, and the bat up here is wagging, trailing behind their hips. And you see in golf how they fidget from foot to foot, and they let the head sort of drag below them. They're all getting connected, and that's this connection of the lower body with the upper body. Continuous motion. It's so important to stay continuous for many reasons. Number one, for your strokes. You want to stay continuous so the racket never hitches, never stops. Same with the ground strokes, right? So this whole idea of having a starting position really, really hurts you, because under pressure, that's when hitches come in. That's when you're stopped and you have to regain your momentum. But if you stay continuous, slow and continuous the whole time, kind of like you are in your ready position, right? You're in your idle position. You're ready to unfold into a forehand or morph into a backhand. That's why you start like this, in my opinion, as opposed to bouncing up and down, because you want to start moving the way you're going to be stroking the ball. So continuous motion is really one of the keys to our system. Contrary motion. So there's a couple ways I could throw this ball in from hand to hand. See, I can move my entire body with the arm. See this? Just move the whole body together. This is sort of an old-fashioned way of playing tennis. Or I could use contrary motion and make it much easier on myself. When I move in this linear way, see how my head moves around? And it's very hard to keep the head in the center. And I'm weighting and unweighting, so I'm really not balanced ever. But it's much easier if I use contrary motion, meaning when my hips go to the right, my arms splay off to the left, and vice versa. See that? So it's much easier to toss this ball. My head stays in the center. See that? My head stays in the center. And we use this idea of contrary motion on every stroke, right? When you go into a serve, one arm is up, one palm is up, one palm is down. They switch places, right? So nonlinear is really the essence of our whole system. Always talking in curves, always talking in contrary motion, meaning it's a system of polarities, right? So if I move one way, my upper body moves the other. And same with the strokes, right? As I go into my turn, my racket stays forward. And then as I go into the hit, and the hips come out into the hit, the racket then comes back and through. And so that's basically contrary motion, where the hips and the upper body are moving contrary to one another. I invented this product. It's called the Extreme Board. It's got a swivel underneath the two swivels on top. And you can see as my upper body goes in one direction, my lower body goes in the opposite. There's literally no way I can have both my upper body and my lower body in the same spot. So it's just another proof that natural motion is contrary motion. See how I rise in a figure eight? So it's horizontal and vertical. See, my arm rises, falls, and rises again, always going in opposition of my lower body. And you can see all the strokes. Backhand, forehand, volleys, overhead. But it's all based on this idea of contrary motion. Convex. When I say convex, that's at the point you're making contact with the ball. I used an expression earlier called bump. How you create the bump is by being convex, or this curve right here. You see, so I go into the stroke concave, but as my hips pull through, you see this elbow's very transitional. It's very important. It's like a universal joint. As my hips come through, you see the elbow goes from coiled and concave here to convex here. Some will call it a lag, but that's a poor term because it's too vague. You really want to be rounded, right like that, convex, right at contact. And same with the backhand. It's a little more natural on the backhand. The tougher part on the backhand is getting coiled like this, in this concave position. But when you come out, the backhand's easy for an awful lot of people, especially on the one-hander, because they come out convex. And that's this part of the sine wave, this part of the curve. So that's when you make contact, is convex at contact. Damping. I don't use this word too often. It's a technical term, mathematical term, but it's basically, it's the retraction of this left hip. See, so if you're moving in a figure eight, it's this part as you come back in, right? You're around the corner, out into the hit, and then it comes back. That's why a lot of players kick their foot back. It's, in mathematical terms, it's damping. But I, as you'll see later, use the term retraction. Dialed in. When you're really dialed in, that means it's almost like you're seeing yourself from above. Everything's flowing very nicely, right? The ball's rising as you rise into your backswing on either side. And as the ball falls, you bring your hips forward. So you're moving with the flow of the ball. So when you're dialed in, you're really dialed into the movement of the ball, and you're dialed into your 45-degree angles, your optimal hitting point. So when I say a player's dialed in, that means they're really locked in that day. They're seeing their hitting point, they're on the hitting point, they're staying continuous internally, and that means they're creating this, beautiful wave from their hips out to their shoulders, out to their arms. Digital. So I'll use that word sometimes when I see a player and they have this one position that they get to, and then they wait for the ball, and then they swing. And they do it on both sides. And even on the volleys, you see them turn, and they abruptly turn their racket face and step forward. And that's very linear or digital way of thinking. And that's really the opposite of our system. We talk in terms of analog motion, where you morph gradually from your center and ripple out to the racket head, as opposed to getting in one position, waiting for the ball, and then following through in a separate position. These are what I would call digital or linear terms. Expand. When I talk about expanding or rippling out into the stroke, it really is just that. With a circle, like dropping a pebble in water, it creates a circle that expands, right? Exponentially. When you do a figure eight, it doesn't expand in a C. If I just turn in a semicircle, my racket would move in a semicircle. But this figure eight is a little more complex, right? It's two circles put together. And what happens there is the arm expands. You see this? It ripples out away from you. It goes concave, convex. So as I go into my turn, into my negative space, the racket gets a little closer to my body. But then as I come out with the hips, you see, it comes from close and goes deep into the 45. So really I start small at the 45, and as I come around the corner with my hips, I go deep at the 45 and make contact. So that's when I talk about expanding or rippling out into the shot, I'm talking about rippling out or expanding from your core in this sine wave out into the 45-degree angle. The figure eight motion, this is core fundamental. This, along with the 45-degree angle and the movement of the arm and the sine wave, this is a true nonlinear tennis fundamental and one of the main tenets of the program. And it's not just the arm that moves in a figure eight. That was the first thing I noticed, was Agassians, the better players, had this beautiful figure eight in their arm. And I was even told many times, oh, hold your arm up here like a tray and then swing it around and come back up. So people did understand the loop. They used to call it the loop forehand and the loop backhand. But really, the figure eight goes much, much deeper. It really starts in the core, and the racket's trailing the whole time. So the real figure eight is right here in your hips. And I like using these swivels because it makes it easy for anyone to understand it. Keeps your head right in the center. You can't move your head. And you learn to move your hips in this continuous motion, right? They never stop, and they're always moving slowly. And then out here, you can see the big, beautiful strokes. You can see the volleys. You can see the overhead and the serve. You see the whole game right here in this figure eight. And that is really the beautiful game of Roger Federer. They always said he sort of moves in circles. Well, they had it half right. He moves in two circles in this figure eight. And that's what made him so effortless, right? The momentum would just continue and just get stronger and stronger as you go through, instead of the old days when you would stop and then start again, right? Here you learn to move continuously from your core out to your periphery, out to your racket head, and you keep it seamless. So you're like a human fabric. And it's almost like a surfer. See this? Figure eight in the surfing. And watch that. And pow. And that's basically how the ball is hit. See that? So it's really about the core doing this nice figure eight, being followed by the arm and the racket. Hips. If you really, you got to get some oil in here, right? You got to make sure you can do this move. Good way to do it, watch this, is by just putting your racket or your fingers in front of you and just drawing an infinity sign. And this way, you get your hips loosened up so you can crank them around, right? Because when that ball comes at me, I'm going to want to really move in my lower body first. You can't be lazy or you can't move with the upper body like this because it takes you out of the stroke, right? So you really want to have some oil in your hips, and you want your knees, look at how pliable my knees are. You want to be able to crank those hips around because that's really where you initiate the stroke, is in the hips. Right, your thought is out at the 45, but your hips is what starts the whole ball rolling, right? That's what grabs your upper body and drags it back and forth. So put some oil in those hips and get them cranked around, And as I always tell you, it takes a lot of effort to look effortless. But if you put it into the beginning of the stroke, it'll be there for you throughout the rest of the stroke. So when I use the phrase crank your hips around, I'm telling you to stop being lazy. I'm telling you off the split step, crank those hips around, get that left hip right around so you can actually have a stroke, right? Because it's the middle body here that pulls at the feet. It's the middle body that pulls at the arms. See that? So if you're a little lazy in here and you don't crank your hips around, meaning if you don't start twisting, right? If you want to coil and then uncoil, twist and then untwist. So you can't be lazy. That first move is really the most important move of the stroke. As soon as you see that ball coming, you really crank the hips around and you make sure you're lining up your 45. If you're lazy on your first move, chances are it's not going to be a good hit. So when I'm talking about the horizontal plane, I mean lateral, right? I mean going this way. See, so my arm's in the horizontal plane. And that's all you really have to know. I like to use this term human fabric because that's really what it feels like. It's almost like in this wind today, you see the windscreens here, they're pushed out or they're pushed in, or when you take a sheet and you pull it like this and you're drying it out in the wind, you see the whole thing's connected and it moves very beautifully. And so I feel that way about the body. If you're really performing the strokes correctly, your body is like a human fabric. You see that, where it starts at the core and goes out, almost like the wind's at my back and the flag is moving like this, luffing in the wind. But it's the entire movement from the very center out to the periphery or the racket head. Kinesthetic learning. I'm a big believer in the theory and the figure eight and all the things that we learn here and we understand to be the nonlinear system, but there's nothing like feeling it. So I have my students use all these different devices, training aids, so they can feel it, so they have kinesthetic learning, right? Instead of understanding just the figure eight rotation and making contact at the 45 and the arm moving from concave to convex, when you get on these devices, you can actually feel it. And you can feel the figure eight, and you can understand the idea of moving slowly and continuously. And then I use other products to explain, the verticality in strokes, like in forehands, the way you rise, and this hip rises and this hip falls. And then when you hit, they level off, right? So this helps a lot with forehands and serves, anything that has verticality, which is every stroke. And then I use the rocker here, pretty much the same reason I use the ramp, right? You get into the ramp position here, but now when you hit, you want to level off. So this kind of forces you, kinesthetically speaking, it forces your body to level off. Because if I stay down here and swing, you see I'll fall right off. So learning kinesthetically is just as important as the theory. See, I'm here. As my racket comes forward, I level off and finish the stroke. And that's what you see in the pros. You see this beautiful movement from the center of their body out to the racket. But I tell you, when you're trying to teach it or trying to learn it, there's nothing like feeling it and having it, sink in to your body through kinesthetic learning. Larger muscles. So when I talk about the larger muscles, versus the smaller muscles, I'm talking about your core, right? Your butt, your stomach, your hips, right in here. This is your largest muscles right in here. And so when you move this slowly, it projects out to the racket head in a much larger way, kind of like dropping a pebble in water, right? It starts very small and tight, the circle, but then it just expands gradually, naturally, and exponentially. Right? It's exponential, so it keeps the same curve, but just gets wider and wider. So our system, we talk about the larger muscles, the hips, as opposed to getting your racket back. Right? So when you get your racket back, you're relying on your smaller muscles, your arm and your shoulders and your wrist. So that's awfully hard to depend on, especially under pressure. But the larger muscles, if you learn to move with the larger muscles to hit the ball, and let it expand out to the racket head, it's just a much easier way to get consistent, and it's more effortless, it's easier on your body, So playing with the, with the larger muscles versus trying to play the game with the smaller muscles, there's really no contest. And the larger muscles, it's the way to play like Roger Federer. It's the only way to play. Linear. Linear motion is basically digital when you're moving, from point A to point B in a straight line. And that is opposed to everything we talk about. Our system's about polarities and curves and no straight lines, not even on the volley, no real straight lines. You always think in terms of being rounded. So we don't really adhere to linear, like you get your racket back in a certain spot and then finish in a certain spot. We understand the whole philosophy of the game. So we realize sometimes, you're around here and it's very close. Other times when you have time on clay or hitting against a slow hitter, you have a longer period to get to that point. But in no way do we ever use the commands that they use in linear teaching. Linear would be racket back here, finish, point at the ball, or point your elbow at the ball. Those are all linear terms, and we stay far, far away from those. We think the ball is round, your hips move in a round way, so why even delve into linear? It's just, for us, it's wrong. Negative and positive space, I'll use those terms sometimes, basically to describe concave and convex, right? So when I go into my coil, I'm using my middle body, my hips here, and I go into this what I call negative space, but that's really going into the coil. That's being concave. And as I come around the corner, I consider going out into the 45, out into the hit and follow through as the positive space. But I don't use that second word too often. I really use the word negative space. Because sometimes I'll see players going out after the ball like this, and I'll say, no, you've got to create some negative space first so you can get back here to contact. So negative space is something I will use occasionally, but it basically represents the concave or the coil part of the stroke. So the 45-degree angle has a lot to do with this idea of negative space. So if this is 0 point, right, if this is a perfect contact point, you're either on this side of it or on this side of it. It's impossible. You don't want to be straight at the 45 because the 45 is just a concept, right? It's a concept of perfection. But there is no perfection in infinity, right? It's always morphing into something else. So I'm either on this side of the 45, which I would call negative space. You see, I'm on the negative side of 0 point. And then as I get closer to the hit, you see my curve goes from concave to convex. But it's this negative space I talk about, going negative or pulling behind the 45-degree angle. Nonlinear. When I use the term nonlinear, which is all the time, I'm meaning exactly what I say, no straight lines. It's always a system of curves that starts in the core and goes out to the racket head. So I'm holding this rope here because I usually use this rope to show people, when you affix one side of the rope, one part of the rope, and you move the other side continuously in a figure 8, you see the rope is always flowing and always moving in a curve. And that's really the basis of the whole system. It's about nonlinear motion as opposed to linear motion, point A to point B in a straight line. We never talk in terms of straight lines. The only time we'll use a straight line is the 45-degree angle, but then I go right into saying that 45-degree angle can't be achieved. You're either on one side of it curved, or you're on the back side of it, convex curved. So you're either concave, and as you approach it, you go to convex. So it is a nonlinear system, meaning no straight lines. We're only talking in curves and continuous motion that keeps morphing into something quite beautiful and nonlinear. Out on the hit. I'll very often say to my students, you want to get out on the hit. And what that means is as you expand, you want to go as deep into the hit as you can without straightening your arm, right? Because if you straighten your arm, it's linear at that point. So you want to be as round, convex as you can, but you want to be as deep into that hit as you can, because then you can move more compact, slower, more controlled, and you're more stable the further you are away from your body. Right, as you get in here, things start to wobble. But when your arm gets nice and round like a big wing and you get out on the hit, so to speak, or deep into the hit, that's when you really get the most out of your strokes. Periphery. I use that word sometimes to talk about out here, out on the contact point, when you make contact with the ball. You're really, in mathematical terms, what you're doing is you're going from a point, right? You're infinite inward, right? Whatever the most center point of your body is. And you're going out to the periphery. And it's all connected. So I use that word. It's really just out to the racket head. But that's what I mean. It's mathematical term. You're going from the center point out to the periphery. But it's all done in a very sequential, natural, geometrically perfect way. I talk about power and slowness. Okay, and when I say that, I really mean it. You watch a guy like Roger Federer or Tiger Woods, and you watch their swings, and at no point do you ever say, oh, that looks fast. They're always moving very slowly, except for when the stroke is over, and you go, wow, that was a really quick hit. But I find when you move slowly, like sort of a bullwhip, right? If I take a bullwhip and go like this, or a towel, right? I wet the tip and I go like this and back. I don't have to do it fast. I do it slow. Because in nature, there's something called the law of conservation of energy. So the same energy that's in the big handle of the whip, or the same energy that's in my core, has to be transferred out to the racket. So when I go to hit a hard ball, I make sure not to try to swing hard. I actually try to stay slow, 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 and that way I stay connected to my body. And by the time I get out to the periphery or to the contact point, the racket is either moving very quickly if I want it to, or it's just so connected to my center that the ball takes off quickly because, you know, I'm pressing more air into the ball, the strings are laying back, everything's just a little more perfect. So you can hit the snot out of the ball moving very slowly. You don't have to jump out of your skin. You don't have to overexert yourself. You can hit a very hard ball. Watch Roger Federer. Very hard ball by moving slowly and letting nature take its course. Well, in the coil, you've got the primary and you've got a secondary part of the coil. The primary part of the coil is really from your center, your core, your belly button, out to about your elbow. Right? That's the biggest part of the coil. But you don't want to let this wrist out too easy. So you want to make sure you keep this racket head pressed forward. That's why so many players will keep their finger on the strings. And even on the serve, you don't want to let it go back here. It's too early. Then you end up pushing the ball. So you want to hold that secondary coil as long as you can so it's naturally pulled out from the core. So there's just two ways you can think about it. The primary coil is basically from your shoulder or your core out to about, you know, the middle of your arm. But then don't forget that wrist. That's your secondary coil, and you don't want to lose it too easily. Make sure it comes out naturally, and you don't just let it be sloppy. Just because you have a coil here doesn't mean you're not going to blow it here. So those are basically your primary and your secondary coil. Projective geometry. Well, there's a complicated term for you. You can Google it, but there's a world of information behind this term projective geometry or nonlinear motion. And I discovered it through a guy named Rudolf Steiner, who really delved into this quite a bit. And it basically showed how you could predict a flag waving in a 40-mile-an-hour wind, or how a tree would naturally move, and even the movements of a horse, right? They don't move in a linear way. They have a figure eight in their motion, and a tiger. And the fastest animal on the planet is a hummingbird, and that's the only animal whose wings move in a figure eight. So there's just infinite power in this nonlinear geometry, and it's a fascinating study. And basically I've taken nonlinear geometry and projective geometry and spatial dynamics, and I've sort of melded them all into our system. And to me it's fascinating, and it makes the game much more interesting to play, to teach. And instead of, you know, when you play in a linear way, you're happy if you hit the zone twice in a lifetime. You know, that's what you hope for, is to hit the zone in a couple of matches. But when you play in this nonlinear way with these laws of projective geometry and spatial dynamics, you're basically in the zone every time you go on the court, because the concepts like the 45-degree angle and the standing wave, they never change. So it's not a matter of feel and of getting your racket back early. Am I low enough? It's really a matter of, am I lining up my shot at the 45, my core, my hips to the 45, and am I making contact out at the 45? And as I use the word nonlinear or projective geometry, that projective meaning you project how it's going to be out here. So when I play, or when I tell my players to play, I always say, go take a dress rehearsal on every ball. If I see a forehand's coming, I know my contact's going to be out here, convex, at the 45. So I basically have hit it once in my mind, and then I go into it the second time, and I make that happen. So I actually get a dress rehearsal on just about every ball, because I see in my mind where it's all going to project out to. And then I pay attention to staying continuous in my hips, staying lined up to the 45. And so projective geometry is just a really fascinating thing to bring into the tennis world in terminology. I talk pulling a rope or tug of war. I use those terms quite a bit. Especially on ground strokes, I talk about this idea of a tug of war. If I'm going to do a tug of war, I wouldn't just do this, right? I'm going to be against a bunch of other people. My lower body would come first, right? And I'd be trying to pull with my upper body. But it wouldn't be that easy. Naturally, it would be my lower body that I'd get into, my center of gravity. And so I use that term quite a bit. And then I use the term pulling up a rope on a serve, right? Because so many people will toss the ball and then get their hand out of the way. Or some will try to toss it and keep it up there. I say no, go beyond that. I say once you let go of that toss, keep the hand following it, and then like in gym class, grab onto a rope in your imagination and pull yourself up the rope like this. So you get a little bit extra, you know, from your lower body to your chest, kind of like a slinky going down a stairs, right? The lower middle part goes first, and then the upper part comes flying. So it's really that feeling of pulling up a rope on the serve is a really good graphic for students or for players to think about. And like I said, it gets you into this natural power of a slinky mode. Some of my players like to even think of it on grounds, on the forehand. You know, when you're out here on the stroke, you just pull the rope into your body like that, and that keeps you lined up to the hit. I would call that compression. But it's a good way to think about it. If that works for you, think about pulling a rope on the whole forehand side. See that? Pulling a rope. Racket head speed. Now that was a buzz term about 10 years ago. They were really using it a lot, and they'll still use it today. But when you think of it in terms of racket head speed, most players just get sloppy. You know, they just try to speed up their arm and their wrist and just swing as fast as they can. Racket head speed should naturally occur. As I said earlier, like dropping a pebble in water, it starts out small in the hips. And then as you get out to the racket head, if you have our contrary motion that we talk about, you'll notice it's kind of like a figure skater. It's impossible to skate in a circle around me as fast as I could pull you. Right? I could pull you much quicker because it's the movement's coming from the core, and you're just holding on for dear life as I whip you around, right? And I don't think you could even skate in a perfect circle around someone. So the idea of racket head speed is kind of a misnomer, because you don't want to think of speeding up your racket to hit a harder ball. And sometimes you can hit a harder ball without thinking of racket head speed at all. Just getting your weight deep into the hit, letting the ball sink deep into the strings, and having putting more pressure into the tennis ball itself. That ball will pop. You'll notice a lot of the players will hit a very, very quick shot and just bump the ball like this from their core, and they'll bump it. But the ball will go very quick. So in order to hit the ball fast, you don't necessarily need racket head speed. But if you're going to get racket head speed, make sure it comes from the core naturally, like that, and not trying to muscle it with your elbow and your arm. Retraction, very important term in our system. Without retraction, you end up being very sloppy. You face the net. If you have good contrary motion, you end up hitting the ball a little wild, a little long, and losing your sort of north star with the 45-degree angle. So retraction is very important, and there's several ways to do it. And what it does, it means when you're doing your figure eight, it literally means retracting your hips going into the next figure eight. See that? I retract, come around, and go again. Retract, come around. So when you're stroking and you've got your hips working, you don't want to over-rotate like this and face the net. So you watch the great players like Fed, Djokovic, all of them, Alcaraz, you pick one, and they all, right at contact, you'll see for a moment their hips come in, so everything's facing, so they've got all this power, and then everything's facing contact, the center of the body and the racket head's facing contact. And there's lots of ways, you can think of it physically with your hips, you want to retract, but a lot of ways people will do it. They'll kick the foot back, see this? They'll kick it behind them like that, like Federer did a lot and Djokovic does a lot. And they'll use their left hand, right? They'll retract and pull this left hand from out here on the hit, and they'll retract it like it's a bird's wing. See, it's a bird's wing, and they just retract it straight in, and that keeps you lined up. On the backhand with the one-hander, you see a lot of players throwing this left hand back. That keeps you lined up. See, that keeps the hip from splaying out. Some players will also slide the foot back. If you remember Billie Jean King, she's the first person that ever taught me that when I was about 21. She said, Brody, throw your foot back on my backhand. And it really did help quite a bit. So retraction is a very, very important term, even on the serve. You know, you don't want to fall over like this and serve. So you make sure to land on the left leg. If you're a righty, you come up and you land on the left leg. You pull your hand from here and you retract it into your body. And these are all ways to get retraction and keep you lined up during contact. Same with the volleys, right? You turn to the volley and then you retract this left hand in like that. And backhand, the left hand comes back. That keeps your hips from opening up too much and dumping it in the net. So retraction is key, and it's a real principle of our system. Shoulder dominant. So I use the term shoulder dominant pretty often, and that is still the tail wagging the dog, right? It's closer to your center than your arms maybe, but the center is still pretty close to right here, right around your belly button. So you really don't want to be shoulder dominant because that puts you off balance in both directions, you see? When I turn my shoulders, I'm off balance to the contact point here. And when I rotate my shoulders too much and become shoulder dominant, then I really miss the sweet spot of the hit. So you want to be centered in your center. Don't be centered up in your brain or closer to your brain, up in your shoulders. Be centered here. Sine wave. The sine wave is just a natural phenomenon. It's actually a standing wave. But when you have a rope and you keep one end stationary and you move the other end without stopping, which means you're in a figure eight of some sort, right? Because you're not stopping. So you're rounding the corners. It creates this standing wave, this phenomenon. And it's really a brilliant thing. And it's used in tennis if you really know what to look for. You see the players, they go into this coil, right? They go into concave part of the coil. And then as their hips come around, it goes out into this part, right, of the sine wave. So you go concave to convex, and it's all done very gradually in a very analog way. So there are nothing's extreme about it. It's just natural. By keeping your hips in a continuous figure eight, it makes the arm go concave to convex out to the 45-degree angle. And that's the sine wave we talk about, and it's the same on the backhand. It's not as easy to see. People think they see the players taking their rackets back. But really what they see is the body turning and them getting into this concave part of the sine wave. And then as their hips come around, you see right back here, it switches to convex. and they make contact right there and bump the ball at contact, whether it's a two-hander or a one-hander. So on the ground strokes, it's really important to understand this standing wave or this sine wave that you create with the continuous slow movements of your hips. Superconsciousness. You know, that's a big deal to me, because with our system, it's not about trying hard, trying my hardest, coach. It's not that physical. It's really up here. And here's where it takes all the effort to look effortless. And so I use the word superconscious because in the past, back in the 70s and 80s, they would always say, oh, look at so-and-so, McEnroe's playing, he's unconscious today. Or McEnroe would say it about other players when he first started commentating. And it sort of taken the meaning that's a good thing. And with our system, it's not a good thing. With our system, we're so defined with the 45 and the figure 8 that if you're paying attention and if you're super conscious, that's when you can play your best. It's all going on in here. So if you, like I said, I'd rather you be super conscious than play unconsciously. You know, be super conscious about the 45. Be super conscious about your lineup. Be super conscious that your hips are never stopping during a stroke. They're always staying continuous. So paying attention and being super conscious is really, it's a key principle in the nonlinear, our nonlinear system. So when you're super conscious or when you're really paying attention, you get in that zone pretty much every time you play. And you don't feel like it was luck, and you don't feel like, oh, I don't even know where I was the last hour. You feel like, you know what? All I did was live into these larger principles by paying attention. And you can literally be in the zone every time you step on the court. In fact, you should be in the zone every time you jump on the court. And that's because you should pay attention and be super conscious of all the nature of going on around you, you know, all your spatial dynamics. You should know your 45. You should pay attention to it. And that's really how you become effortless, is by using a lot of effort up here and being super conscious. When we are in the zone, we know we're in the zone, and we know why we're in the zone, right? We're paying attention to all of our core fundamentals and core principles, and it's not a mystery as to why we're in the zone. When you're unconscious, like a linear player will be, and you get into that zone, you know, maybe accidentally or for 15 minutes, or maybe a whole match if you're lucky, you know, you just go, yeah, I don't know what I did today, but I was terrific. With us, you know, I would always ask my top players, you know, when we play these national tournaments, you know, you played pretty well today, Steve, or this or that. And they go, yeah, I played all right. It's always all right because we know what we're doing. So we know we can get into that zone every time, and that's what makes it so special. Being in the zone and being conscious of why you're in the zone versus being in the zone and having no idea and being completely playing out of your mind or, you know, unconsciously. So I think our way is definitely a way to be much more consistent and consistently playing your best tennis. Our nonlinear tennis system is really a system of polarities, meaning, you know, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So when I push down into my left hip, my feet swivel to the right and my hands go to the right like this to keep everything in balance, to keep my head on straight. And then when I switch, they level off for a minute, and then sometimes I can even finish back here as you see the players jump up off the ground. But really, you just have to understand that the hands, they mirror off of one another. See that? And they're always in balance. And when one hip and one shoulder rises, like here on the serve, the other hip and shoulder fall. See that? So you get this nice slope. And then you meet at the top, you're balanced, and follow through. So as I go into my coil, I push down and come back with my feet. And then as I level off and go into the hit, I go in the opposite direction. And that makes it the effortless stroke, having all of these polarities working together. Same with the backhand. I get into my coil, I push into it, and then I level off as I hit. And it's obvious to see on the serve, right? You coil, and then as you go up into the hit, the hands change places. And instead of being sloped in this direction, now you level off, and at one point you're sloped in the other direction. So it's always this system of polarity that's going on that really makes our nonlinear system work. Universal stroke. I talk about the universal stroke, especially in the beginning when I'm working with someone, and I try to explain to them, you shouldn't have a weaker side, because both sides really mirror off of one another, right? Your figure eight starts it, and look at how my racket trails in a figure eight. So the end of my forehand is the beginning of my backhand, and the end of my backhand is the beginning of my forehand. It's really just one stroke that's mirrored on both sides. Pow. See that? And then pow. It's the same stroke. It's basically your ready position, right? Your non-static, non-linear ready position that morphs into something larger. So it's really not a whole bunch of strokes in tennis. Even your volleys, look at that. Pow, pow, pow. Right there, the perfect angle with the continental grip and the perfect spot to hit it at the 45. And so really the two strokes mirror off of one another, and it's really just one universal stroke. When I use the term vertical plane, I'm talking about the vertical, up and down. You follow me like this? So that is the vertical going straight up and down, where the horizontal is going sideways. That's it. And of course, our 45-degree angle bisects them perfectly, and that's why it's so iconic in our system. So when you start to loosen up your hips and move your hips continuously, what happens a lot of times is the racket will stay in this horizontal plane. And that's not the whole stroke. You're really missing half the stroke. And most players will do this. They'll just stay in the horizontal. You want to rise with the rise of the ball. So as that ball rises and comes over the net, like Fed and all the other players, you want to rise with it. Right? You see on both sides, the racket usually passes right by their chin or their eyeballs, and then comes down the hill and through. So having that verticality gives you about 50% more power. So instead of trying to get further back in the horizontal to get more power, you just rise up here and then come down and into the hit. So I like using the ramp to illustrate this. You see, so as I turn, I naturally, this left hip sinks, right hip rises, my arm rises naturally just by turning, see that? And then when I come through, you know, I'm not only using the horizontal plane, but I'm using the vertical plane as well. And it's the same with all the strokes. And sometimes I'll even put the swivels. I'll use the ramp with and without the swivels. But sometimes I put the swivels right on top of the ramp. So now they feel the verticality and that horizontal movement with the feet. See that? They feel the horizontal. But because it's on the ramp, you rise and fall into the swing. And there's that nice figure eight. Remember, the figure eight rises. Just like a wave on the ocean. It wouldn't be too beautiful if it was just a horizontal movement. It has to rise. And that's the same here. You rise up into the stroke and then level off as you hit it. So I think it's another great way to feel verticality is with the ramp and even the rocker, but particularly the ramp. Seeing yourself from above. To me, that is really a crucial thing when you get to a certain level in your tennis game. You want to be your own best spectator, okay? I remember about 5 years into Roger Federer's incredible run back in the early 2000s, he was asked, you know, did an interview with one of the tennis magazines, and they said, what's it like to be Roger Federer out there on the court playing a match? Because he was such a special player. And his answer really coincides with how I feel about the game. He goes, you know, I feel like a spectator when I'm playing. He says, when I'm moving the ball, it's almost like I see myself from the stands, and I see how I'm going to move into the stroke and what I'm going to do. And I think that perspective is a much better perspective. I've always wished that the commentators and the videographers and the pro matches you see on TV, I always wish they would show the whole stroke from above, so you could see how the head doesn't move. Right? You see this dot, how it sort of goes down and up. And you see how the racket, you know, and the bodies line up to the 45 and the racket goes in and out of the 45 like this. And I just think, if you think about seeing yourself from above and just see the lines coming off of you, like God looking down, what would he see? Would he see that dot? Or would he see you leaning over? Would he see that nice transition out into the stroke? You know, and that nice sine wave going out into the stroke? Is that what he would see? So I like to think about that when I play quite a bit. I like to be my own best spectator and view myself from above. 0 point. I use this term a lot. When you're waiting for return to serve, where's your 0 point? Well, it's the other side of the net, or it's facing it. Maybe if you have a waiting on return to serve like this, your 0 point's facing your server. But as soon as you see which side of the ball, you know, your body the ball is going to, if it's a forehand or a backhand, you change your 0 point. It is no longer straight ahead. Now you go, oh, here comes a forehand. You create this new 0 point. You see the best players, they're right here for the first brief second of their stroke. And you see they're lining it up. And that is your 0 point. And then you want to go a little inside of it, or negative space. And then as you hit 0 point again, you go convex, you see? So it's an optical illusion. You're not actually bringing the head forward. You're just staying convex, and your racket's still going out to 0 point, that perfect balance point. And then the follow-through is more like this. A lot of people think the follow-through is this way, but it's not. You want to be on this 0 point, and you want to sort of ripple along it. See how I'm curved, and I go right along it, and then I finish. I'm on the back side of it with going from concave to convex, and then the stroke just disappears. So it's the same on both sides. I see it's a backhand. First thing I do is line up my inner body, right? My innermost body and my periphery, my outermost. And I line them both up to the hit, and then I see the hit, and then I go back out into it and back at 0 point again. This hand comes back to keep me there so I don't lose it. And then I just let the racket disappear after I get out as deep as I can into the hit, and then it just disappears. So those are your 0 points of the 45-degree angle.